Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Katherine Boyle, returning to the Venture Stories podcast. Katherine, we last time talked about deep tech. Here we're here today to talk about religion and media. And Katherine, you are a partner at General Catalyst. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back. I know a very different discussion than the one we had last time, but I'm excited.
Yes. Totally. Let's get into it. So you recently wrote this great post in the Washington Post about how San Francisco has digitized so many industries, but hasn't really penetrated religion in the same way. Why don't you unpack the points in your piece and why you wrote the piece in the first place?
Certainly. So yeah, it's been a question of mine for a long time. When you look at just all of consumer technology and just how particularly venture has been focused on so many categories, there's always this meme that there really isn't anything left. And if you belong to a religious community, you look at websites that seem to be like old GeoCities websites plucked from the 90s. I mean, it's like the technology used by churches and particularly the technology used to help someone in their faith is quite nascent. And so I've been spending a lot of time with companies of various faith traditions that are venture backed, that are looking at building supplements or building communities for people that belong to certain faith traditions. And what's surprising is a couple things. There's more than people would imagine for various faiths. And then two, during COVID, these companies really saw an interesting bump. And so my kind of interest in this is that these companies are doing much better than anyone would expect. If you're listening to kind of the predominant media narrative, Pew Research Forum is probably the best place to go for information about how religious identification is in the US. And religiosity in the US and in Western Europe in particular has been on the decline for the last 10 years. In 2019, the Pew Forum put out a study saying that only 65% of Americans identify as Christian broadly, which is down by 12% over the last decade, which is a huge decrease. And that the fastest growing religious affiliation is the nones category, or people who don't consider themselves to be affiliated to any category. So it's interesting that you would see these sorts of pops in spirituality and in questioning, or people who are interested in faith, given that the decline is happening at the church level. So I think there's a number of people who have hypotheses, and particularly the founders that I've talked to, is that it's not necessarily that people are losing faith or losing interest in religion. It's that they're the sort of antiquated measures that we have of, I go to church at a specific time, or, we only meet in person, is not really fulfilling the needs of sort of this new generation of faith seekers. And so what's interesting is a lot of these companies are building tools that help with Christian meditation, or that help with building communities in different faiths that allow people to supplement their faith or re-engage with it in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do 10 years ago.
Yeah. You mean fastest rising religion or religious group besides politics and partisan politics? And people channeling their interest in that. I mean, give us a little bit of historical overview of, didn't the Christian right used to have much more moral authority in society? How did we become less secular, and why is that changing a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. I think, if you look at the last 15 years, secularization has definitely been on the rise in terms of how we affiliate with churches, but then also even just the media conversation of how we talk about politics. I'd say that if you look at kind of 2004, which is the election that people really point to as the Christian right having sort of its last stand, that was an election that feels like, a very, very long time ago, even though it's 16 years ago. Like the kind of political lines have been redrawn, and the power of the Christian right as a political movement, I think, has softened greatly. And even in, I think Donald Trump's presidency is an example of that. He didn't run on a kind of, traditional Christian platform, although we'll see if that changes given the Bible photo op he recently did. But I think the more telling information is just the amount of times that people go to church. So people used to identify as Christian and maybe not show up in seats. And the Pew Forum has really shown that there's become this kind of, less need to identify with a religion than there used to be, say, 20 years ago, or even particularly 50 years ago. I mean, people used to be very vocal about what religion they identified with. And I think now the sort of narrative of, wow, there really aren't butts and seats, and people really aren't affiliating publicly is sort of what's happened over the last 10 years. And what I think people who are watching this space are asking is that going to change given a lot of the political climate? To your point, we are more polarized than we've ever been. Polarization has increased along political lines. And so does that lead people to start seeking for something beyond themselves? And what will that seeking look like? Because it likely won't be going back to the pews every Sunday. It'll likely be some sort of different seeking, but it could be within the context of traditional religion.
Yeah. What's your sort of armchair take, to your point, on why we are more polarized than we've ever been, or what are the biggest factors that have led to that?
Oh gosh, I mean that is a very difficult question to answer, and one I've been thinking about, a lot this week. I think it is hard to look at the combination of factors that have led to this, and I'd rather just look at it as kind of specific factors. I do think secularization in particular is something that has led to that. If you look at just kind of the history of secularization in various countries, with Europe being a good example because they've sort of been, say, decades ahead of us on this trend for a long time, polarization has increased in those countries as well. And so I do think there is a link between, if you don't have a unifying factor beyond the state, if the state is sort of the highest authority, and particularly if human rights, which has become sort of the language of polarization in many ways, if human rights are conferred by the state versus conferred by something outside of people, it's hard to find sort of common ground. And so I do think a lot of polarization has to do with language. It has to do with sort of, what people prioritize. And is there something outside of these sort of tribal groups that people identify with that they can rely on to bring them together with other groups? There's a lot of other things I think people point to. I mean, definitely the technology products that we've built, kind of the communication systems that we've built. I on the media side of this, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, I do think that polarization has increased because of the change in the fairness doctrine. Which is not necessarily, I actually am in favor of the fact that there are more voices in the media space than there have ever been, and that it's possible to have sort of, anyone can open up a blog, anyone can open up a Substack, anyone can have their own podcast and broadcast their views. But that sort of selection of being able to get the news from specific areas or specific personalities has definitely increased polarization and allowed for more choice in terms of the types of news that you'll get. So the big question of what has increased polarization, I think it's along many, many lines. It's not only politics, it's not only media, it's not only increased secularization or even people not identifying with cities or rural. There's so many different lines, but it's a confluence of all of these factors coming together at a time when the sort of news cycle in particular is accelerating greatly.
Yeah. Some people blame sort of the lack of sort of greater collective identity. We have collective identities. They're just like Democrats, Republicans, and they're just at war. But the sort of the lack of coherent and collective identities in religion used to be a huge one. Nationalism is another one. And if we don't have that, it seems we need to find other sort of greater collective identities that we can cohere around. To that end, this is a very difficult question, but if you were deemed sort of the polarization czar and were given, I don't know, $10 billion or $50 billion, basically unlimited money to try to lessen the polarization, let's say in the United States, what might you consider?
Oh gosh, I mean that's a difficult question because I'm looking at kind of what's happening in the media space right now, which is a space that I've studied in depth, given that I was a former reporter. And the polarization, even in the media right now, at op-ed pages in particular, I mean, the big story this week has been sort of the New York Times backtracking on the op-ed from a sitting senator. And no matter what you think about the decision of the New York Times, which is clearly, very controversial, if you're right-leaning, you likely disagree with the decision for them to put their notice. If you're left-leaning, you think that it's a righteous act. No matter what, it's just a perfect illustration of how polarized even sort of the elite sources of information, like how polarized a newsroom can be, how polarized along generational lines universities can be. And so what's really interesting about this is that all of these institutions are sort of having this moment where they have to reckon with generational differences and ideological differences within their own elite structures. And it'll be interesting to see whether COVID has a big impact on this, particularly at the university level, because I do think that a lot of the polarization that we're seeing comes from, these sort of siloed academics, siloed, media influencers who have one area that they cover and are maybe not engaging with other concepts or ideas or types of people. But how would I spend $50 billion? I mean, that is a really good question that I actually haven't thought about, because I've been more diagnosing the problem versus thinking about solutions. And I'm not sure I'm the right person to come up to a solution with polarization globally.
Totally. And a very difficult question. Let's get into the New York Times story. I really wanted to get in because it illustrates a bunch of things that you've been talking about previously about the tension between institutions and individuals, and how journalists want to sort of maximize their individual voice, and sometimes that's sort of at the expense of institutional uniformity, perhaps. And the Barry Weiss sort of tweet about how there's this generational divide between the older group that valued sort of this civil libertarianism. You tweeted this quote, I disagree with I might disagree with you, but I'll defend your right to say it. That sort of ethos. And then there's this younger crowd, or this other crowd, prioritizes maybe what they'd call justice, and this is the right thing, and we can't have fascism or whatever they might say. And then you were saying that the media is more ideologically polarized, and the universities too. Some people might just say that, is it really polarized, or did it just like move uniformly left? And so where do you net out on what's your opinion on what's happening here? If you were still a journalist at the New York Times, you were a Washington Post, but if you were at New York Times, what might your opinion be or stance be? What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and I point to a few examples of when I think what is happening is that institutions can no longer protect their journalists, and journalists no longer think of themselves as bound to an institution. And so an example of that I've pointed to a few times is a journalist named Felicia Sonmez at the Washington Post, an excellent political reporter who had spoken very publicly before about a sexual assault that happened to her. And she'd spoken on her Twitter feed, on her channels, multiple times, and is sort of known among maybe 10% of her following on Twitter follow her because she's an outspoken person for victims' rights. When Kobe Bryant died in January, she tweeted a headline, no commentary, no context, about his rape case. And it caused a huge outcry on social media. I mean, I've never seen someone get ratioed so quickly. And the editors of the Washington Post, Marty Barron in particular, who's the executive editor, sent her an email that then became public that said, please stop, you're hurting this institution. And what's interesting is that, Marty Barron is one of the most effective editors in the country. He was the editor who was in Spotlight, who led the investigation against the Catholic Church in Boston for priest abuse. Like these are people who I would argue are at the top of their game, and they're having very ideological differences about what it means to be a journalist and what it means to speak publicly, given that these institutions are under attack. The Washington Post is under attack by many different other institutions, including the President of the United States, who calls it the Amazon Washington Post. So it is a trying time, I think, for journalists who often align on the same value set. I think, everyone, something like 90% of the Washington Post voted for Barack Obama. It might be higher than that. I'd say the same is probably true of the New York Times. Like these are progressive institutions, even by their own kind of calculations. But along these lines of what it means to value speech, and particularly what it means to give voice to people who might have differing opinions to the people on staff, there is a wide array of opinions of what should be said and what can't be said. And I do think that it has to do with the business model. Some of it is ideological, but the other part of this is, if you are a journalist at the New York Times or the Washington Post, the way that you make a name for yourself is by having a Twitter audience. It is by amalgamating voices on your platform and becoming someone who's more powerful than the institution. And so I think that's the difficult thing, is there's this tension between what does it mean to be an institutional reporter And what does it mean to create your own brand and your own following so that you can move up in the organization or get a book deal or become a CNBC contributor? Those are important things to the livelihood of journalists who don't make much money. So there is this tension both on the how do I remain true to the institution, but also how do I create a brand for myself?
And in that op-ed specifically, I believe it was a viewpoint shared by 58% of Americans. It's a senator. The New York Times, people say it doesn't have much political diversity within it. I guess what's the best counter argument for why? Because to me, it seems obvious that piece should have been published. I don't understand why, if most of the country supports it, if it's a respectable person, why is that not appropriate for the New York Times? And then my question is, should the New York Times be somewhat representative of the country, either politically or at least try to represent them if they don't have their views themselves? What are your thoughts on that?
So in some ways, and from everyone that I've read who's been, saying that this is not the appropriate time to post this piece and this piece is actually calling for violence, I think that the best interpretation I've heard is that it's sort of a literal versus sort of, a literal interpretation of what the words said versus the context in which the words were said. So the senator also said some things that were, much more volatile on Twitter, where people interpreted them as calling for violence. It is a horrific time in the country in terms of how people are feeling and in terms of, watching military take to the streets. That it was, and even the headline, which, headlines tend to always, try to grab attention was, send in the troops, this sort of militaristic, turning on your own citizens, which I think is sort of the number one concern of what's happening in the country. And so I think there's some editors, and particularly the editors originally who published it, believed that, this is a senator, this is something that people, are agreeing with, and this is a widespread view of a lot of people in the country. We should hear this voice. And the New York Times is actually pretty open with a lot of the stories that it publishes. It published a story by the Taliban, and that's sort of what the right is pointed to as, okay, if you're going to publish the Taliban, you have to publish senators as well. But I think on the more progressive side, the view is, is this the right tone of a piece? Is this piece actually going to is it calling for violence, or is it saying things because of the context that could actually harm people? And to me, I haven't been in the town hall meetings in the New York Times. I probably am not the right person to comment on the internal discussions there of kind of what's happening. But I do think, there's valid arguments on both sides of that. And it's a very hard discussion to have in real time. And editors, this goes back to even why, I think people are calling for tech companies to have more thoughtfulness around the editing of pieces, because editors have always had to deal with this question of, is it appropriate to publish if it could harm national security? Is it appropriate to publish this if it could harm citizens? Like, that's always been a question in media. It's sort of the age-old question of what is the role and responsibility of publishers? That I think is coming up because this is such a difficult time for the country.
Yeah. Do you think this leads to a fundamental change? Is the New York Times going to release less op-eds? Like, does it lead to less, diversity? You're talking about the fairness doctrine. Is maybe that repealed in some way? Or like, what do you think changes going forward as a result of this, if anything?
Well, yeah, the fairness doctrine, is no longer in effect. And I actually think that's why you've seen the rise of podcasting. That's why you've actually been able to see institutions be a lot more open with the types of voices that they have. What I think will happen with institutional journalism is that, you're already seeing people like Matt Taibbi join Substack full time because of what's happening in newsrooms. And it's been sort of whispered, that there's certain views or stories or things that don't get published that people want to do on their own. And there didn't used to be tech products that would support that. It used to be very difficult. I was unemployed in 2009 when I was a journalist, and trying to find sources of income that would allow me to write stories was impossible. And the only answer was to be a freelancer and to hope that you would be able to get work. I think every journalist who was recently laid off because of COVID can now join Substack and bring their following from Twitter with them and do the stories they were doing before. That's extraordinary. And so I think you're going to see just a multitude of voices continue to do work independently, particularly if they are of the stature of someone who has 50,000 followers that, has a following that will pay for their newsletters and pay for their work. I think we'll just see more and more of that. The question will become, is it preferable for these journalists to become independent? And a good example of this is I was at the Washington Post in 2014 when Ezra Klein left Wonk Blog, which was his primary blog on the Washington Post, and started Vox. And that's a perfect example of someone who had a incredible following and could become more powerful by starting a company around his own following and his own brand. So I think you're going to see more journalists do that, but it won't necessarily look like venture-backed companies. It'll look like independent small businesses where people make a great living just doing the work.
And what led to the fairness doctrine not being in effect anymore? Was it a specific event or just gradual?
So the revocation, so it was actually, and I'm blanking on the timeline of it, but it was under the Reagan administration when it was fully revoked, or actually no, it was revoked under the Reagan administration, fully revoked under the Obama administration, I think in 2012. But what it basically says is, in the 50s and 60s, there's a reason why there was sort of a mono narrative in the news, and it was because there were 3 channels in which you could get, your televised news from, and there was a view that this is kind of both sides journalism that we're very familiar with as consumers. Is you had to present both sides of an argument. It was considered fair on the one hand. This is what these people say. On the other hand, this is what these people say. And there was a lot more sort of tethering around what could be said on these 3 channels. And when you opened up the lines of syndication, and particularly, the internet changed everything. But even before the internet, talk radio was actually the battleground for this. When you open up the lines of communication and tell people they can actually, spout their opinions or give news that's one-sided, it allowed for talk radio to blossom. That allowed then for internet platforms to blossom. And there's always been a discussion about whether the revocation of the fairness doctrine, which didn't happen fully until 2012, but was in effect happening since the 80s, whether that just completely changed the media culture. It gave rise to organizations like Fox News. It gave rise to different voices and alternative voices. And, I think it remains back to your original question of why are we polarized? I do think that's one good example of why we were polarized, because, that changed the way that people could receive their news. My opinion is that the best way to fight that kind of polarization is to just have more voices. And that's why I'm excited about platforms like Substack and excited about all these new monetization channels for independent creators, because it allows people to just have more access, which I think is very important. But it also kind of puts the onus on the consumer to make sure that they're not staying in their silo and that they're actually seeking information.
Is there a 2020 version of the fairness doctrine, or is it sort of an even antiquated concept and it's really just consumer choice?
It's interesting because I think that the battle lines on the fairness doctrine, and it was, between 2000 and 2010, there was a lot of discussion about, is this actually really dangerous? And it was often discussed in terms of talk radio and Fox News. The lobbying in Washington that actually made it almost, I think it makes it impossible to bring back the fairness doctrine, is the fact that the big tech companies, would fail if they didn't have this freedom of speech element, if they had to define themselves as publishers. All of the content channels, everyone from Google to Facebook, this is an important, part of kind of freedom of the internet. And so it was interesting, to see kind of these strange bedfellows that the sort of more progressive companies in Silicon Valley were actually the ones that sort of forced this to happen under the Obama administration, that, that we need to have open lines of communications and free thought on the internet. And, I think there is still debate. It's definitely something that's discussed, but I think the debate happens more in the lines of, okay, private companies have a responsibility, as we saw with Twitter, to decide what their terms of service are and what they're going to flag. I think that's where the debate is headed for sort of, 2020, less about the legislation and more about kind of forcing companies, both inside of companies and outside of companies. Employees, I think, are sometimes the most vocal, but forcing companies to take a stronger stand on the terms of service seems to be where the battle is now.
Yeah. Let's talk about the move to subscription and how that changes journalism. Like sometimes I'll see, conservatives will unsubscribe to the New York Times and say, hey, it's too liberal. I mean, sometimes right now a bunch of liberals just unsubscribe because of the Tom Cotton piece. But if you're a conservative and you're unsubscribing to New York Times, doesn't it mean that New York Times is just going to become even more liberal because they don't have you as a customer anymore? Does subscription just further polarize in terms of now you just serve your niche and you serve them super well, i.e. give them the one-sided thing they want to hear? What's your take?
I don't know that the subscribers actually dictate the editorial view of these large institutions. because these large institutions are constantly competing for eyeballs. It goes beyond just, okay, who's paying for the newspaper. All of the major contributors at all, Fox News, CNBC, MSNBC, they all come from newspapers. They all come from publications. People are more competing to be the lead of the national conversation. And what I think is just, the sad reality of just how humans work is that the polarizing conversations get the most airtime. And so I don't know that, lack of subscribers to any of these institutions is going to change how the news industry functions. News has always looked for salacious stories, always looked for polarizing stories. The investigations that matter most are the ones that are going to win you the Pulitzer. These are actually things that really matter. So I don't know that if I unsubscribe to any of these newspapers, if that's actually going to change their editorial slant. I think it's more, I think if you trace sort of why newspapers have changed over the last 40 years, one thing that has happened in the newspaper industry is, it used to be sort of this cottage industry, trade industry, where if you were a reporter, you may not have gone to college. You may have had a father that worked as a newspaperman and you became one, and it was sort of this craft. And in the 80s and 90s, it became an elite profession that was very difficult to get into and that very educated people went into. It wasn't necessarily that way, before the 90s. So I think that's definitely been a change of the tone and the tenor of stories has become, less community focused in many ways, not only because of the business model, but because the people who are writing and the people who are editing have probably a much more global and kind of macro view.
Yeah. My more positive view on subscription is that it might change how we even think about journalists in the first place, in the sense of, my guess is that there are a bunch of journalists who are very good, or some journalists who are very good at bringing traffic through, very sort of sensationalist or almost gossip stories, but that some of them would have very little subscriber numbers. And I'm thinking of TMZ or Gawk. I don't know how much you're going to pay to hate on somebody else. Somebody else, you pay if you really love something or it adds value to your life. You might pay for a one-sided story, but it has to have more substance to it. So maybe a writer who was getting 100,000 hits on a piece might only get 1,000 subscribers, and thus would be worth less or respected less than somebody who only gets 20,000 hits on a piece but has 10,000 subscribers. More of the Ben Thompson. So I wonder if that might become more of the norm, because when we think about journalists today, we don't think about that. We think more about the person who's getting hundreds of thousands of hits, but who isn't necessarily respected in the way of people wouldn't necessarily pay for them in the same way. Does that resonate with you?
Yes. No, I think subscription is the future of good journalism. And I think talented journalists will be able to get subscribers and that it might look different in terms of whether they're at an institution or whether they're a small business themselves. But I do think that subscription is, a favorable way for us to go. What's interesting, though, is when you look at the most trafficked sites in terms of news sites, I believe the Daily Mail is still the most trafficked news organization on the web. And, that is a tabloid in Britain that caters to, celebrity and royal news and sensationalist news. Their model clearly isn't, they're not charging for people to come to the site. And I don't know that people would go to the site for that reason, but it is the most trafficked site. And so there are different models and clearly, people will pay for great journalism, but advertisers will pay for those kinds of eyeballs as well.
Yeah. If Daily Journal would have, tens of thousands of subscribers, then I will lose faith in humanity.
Anyone who's a subscriber to the Daily Mail, I don't think that anyone would admit it, but that they it would be surprising if there were subscribers that are excited about that content.
Totally. So journalism, the business model has been disrupted, but the actual product itself, I feel like some people are trying to disrupt it more, like our friend Balaji. He talks about these citizen journalists, but also just this idea of open source journalism, or I don't know, replicable journalism. But he has some analogy to sort of peer review in academia, or it being able to be replicated, or reproducible journalism. Where do you agree and disagree with Balaji on journalism?
It's interesting because I've morphed my views over time. I think the media has changed, particularly the tech press has changed in the last few years in terms of how they cover institutions. And that's where I think a lot of Balaji's argument has been, that we need independent journalists who are verified, who are subscribed to by reputation, because the tech press has a lot of power. I very much agree with Balaji that we need independent voices and that we need independent journalists. Like that, what I think is happening, and we see it constantly of people who reach a certain level of fame or of importance, or they say something, they might hit a tripwire and say something that causes them to either have to leave their job or causes them to really question whether they can do the type of editorial reporting that they need to do. Best example of this is, I think, the reporters who were working on COVID, and that's where Balaji has really talked about why we need independent journalists, because in the early days of COVID, the media largely got that story wrong. If you look back through a lot of the headlines at the institutional press, if you were, saying that COVID is going to be a disaster, if you were saying that people need to lock themselves down and be in their homes, you couldn't say that. And the early stories that really, I think, made Balaji sort of a kind of focal point of this debate is that, he was mocked by Vox for saying he wouldn't shake hands, or for talking about Andreessen Horowitz having a sign that says, "No handshakes, please." And so that, I think, is a really good example of, a public health crisis is exactly the time where you want to hear debate, and you want to hear more voices, and you want experts to be able to dig in and actually find out what's happening. And there's a reason why institutional media didn't get that story early. And so I think we need to dig into why that is happening and correct it on the institutional level. But also, if we had more independent voices and people listened to those voices more, it could have prevented, and to what degree, I don't know, but it could have led to a different conversation at a national stage. So I think that is the, probably the strongest argument I've heard for independent voices, because it's not about, op-ed debates or value debates. It's literally about public health. And that is, something I think we can all agree on, that we need to have the right facts and the right data presented to as many people as possible, as early as possible.
Yeah. And Jessica, lesson as a follow-up to Balaji, which is basically like, hey, great journalism takes teams working together. It can't just be everybody, in their silo. And maybe, Substack now has group bundles, and maybe there'll be some hybrid there with this new subscription model. The thing I worry about, I'm curious to get your take on, is basically, so if journalists are here to keep technologists accountable or keep business accountable, who keeps them accountable? Or who keeps the people in the platforms that host public discussion, which is one, journalists and media corporations, but then also tech companies like Facebook and Twitter. I worry that there is a increasing political monoculture, i.e., only one side is represented at those companies. And then two, that they are getting more trigger happy as it relates to censorship. And I think we don't have really institutions that keep either of them accountable. And I think, and because of that, I think free speech on those platforms is more important than ever, such that the people on them can represent themselves fully. What is your take on that point, and just where censorship and free speech are right now?
Yeah, I've heard this discussion a lot about who keeps who holds the journalists accountable, and I'm less concerned about that, because I do think that we are living in a time where the New York Times and the Washington Post have lost a lot of their power as monopolistic forces of the dominant narrative. They put forth one story, but then there's 10,000 other outlets that have different takes on it. There's a lot more media skepticism at the moment. So I worry that institutions aren't going to be able to do the big scoop. That there's sort of been an undercutting of the faith that we put into these institutions to when we actually need them to do important investigations. Would we be able to have a Watergate that everyone agreed happened, in this environment? And that's what I worry about. In terms of who should hold them accountable, I do think that independent voices are holding them accountable. I think tech, if you look over the last few years, has become much more aggressive in putting forth their own stories on platforms like Twitter and platforms like Facebook. People are going directly to their consumers in a way, very authentically. And that didn't happen 5 years ago in any business. So I do think that has been one sort of result of sort of this, what you're pointing to, which is that journalists have become far more aggressive on the tech side on certain issues that are, important to them. The other thing that I think is important to remember is that not all journalists are the same. And one of the things that I'd love to see more research in is, the tech press. Most of the kind of notable tech journalists that we know came out of the blogosphere. Like Ezra Klein was a blogger, like Recode very much started as an all things D blog. Like these were people who were a different style of journalism and were very much kind of in the scene. It started out as tech journalism decades ago was very much like fanboy journalism, people who were interested in gadgets and, interested in the actual underlying technology. And that's changed. Like it's very much become now the bloggers have become, these seasoned reporters at New York Times, Washington Post, and they have the voice of a blogger still. So there's a tone of snark that did very well in the blogosphere and that like very much still rules the internet, but doesn't necessarily jive with how kind of traditional reporters who've been at these institutions for 20 years have been taught to write stories. So there is a huge difference between like the political press in Washington and how they write and how they snark about things, which is very different than sort of the tech press, which has always had this sort of voicey, combative, more loose style, just because of where these journalists came from.
Yeah, and what sort of led to the introduction of snark as such a predominant sort of tone? Is it largely just the medium as the message, and the internet rewards snark more than TV does, or something? Or
the kind of formal voice of institutions and print reporting. Even when I was at the Washington Post, I mostly did sort of traditional print reporting, which is it's funny to even say print versus digital, but like there used to be a divide until very recently between those two groups of reporters. And the kind of uniformity of the voice and the importance of maintaining credibility is used to be paramount for these institutions. And where I think that's changed is that the people who are the most artful online, like if I just, put something very simple in a tweet that is very straight and is not interesting, no one's going to like it. But if I make a joke, or if I snark at someone, or if I do something that has a lot of authenticity and character, I'm going to get retweeted. So I just think the incentive structure of the platforms that are dominated by journalists has encouraged voice and encourage authenticity, just as every platform has for every person. And I don't know that institutions can fight against that anymore.
Yeah, when you're competing with everybody for attention, you have to stand out in a way that when you're not, you can just tell the story straight because you have their attention. That makes sense. Some people call the golden age of journalism, maybe around the Watergate era, or maybe just last century when there were sort of local SaaS businesses. Had monopolies of distribution, and there's sort of a uniformity of people had similar sort of ideas around what was happening in the world. Some people say the golden age is back when Ben Franklin was writing under 15 different pseudonyms, and it was sort of the wild west, but wasn't prone to sort of a uniformity of thought, or sort of cancel culture, or sort of different things that are happening now. What's your take, and which era are we more likely to go back to? The one of last century, or the one of sort of the wild west?
I mean, I think we're already in the wild west, as you suggested. I mean, I think the rise of pseudo anonymity on a lot of these platforms shows us that people want to be able to speak in a way that isn't necessarily in line with a lot of kind of the journalistic standards, or sort of the standards that people expect. And so, I do think there's been a lot of good writings about how, having control of the syndication as 3 channels and major papers did in the 50s through the 80s and 90s, that was a very unique time. And it was also a very unique business model in which advertisers controlled a lot of what was happening in the editorial. And one of the things that they really wanted was they wanted these unbiased platforms. Macy's wanted to advertise on platforms that weren't, conservative or weren't liberal. And so that's why you had these institutions that were very much on the one hand. On the other hand, right now, I'd say advertising has been kind of decreased in importance, and subscription is becoming much more important. And you're going to see people who have a very clear and specific, authentic way of looking at things, and they're going to be more open about it. I think the openness is actually really good and healthy for democracy, because then it allows the reader to make a decision. Oh, this person voted for this person, has a clear view, and this is how they interpret the world, and this is their worldview, and this is the type of reporting they're giving me. And it just allows for more choice, which I think is really important for a healthy conversation and healthy media environment.
Yeah. Is there a world in which institutions will restore their credibility, or are they forever going to be, continuously fragmenting because there's sort of this democratization of access and everyone's trying to disrupt each other, that, faith in media corporations isn't going to come back, be restored to what it was, or maybe even universities? Or what's your take on, there was a book, Revolt of the Public. What's your take on sort of our faith in these institutions?
It's interesting because I love that you pointed not just to media institutions, which I think often bear the brunt of this argument, but it's everything from elite education institutions, religion, as we were talking about before, monarchies across the world. Like any institution, what I think is interesting is any institution that has existed with authority for a long time is being questioned. And I do think part of the reason for that is sort of this opening up of what's happening in institutions. When media started allowing for reporters to be on Twitter and to be snarking about subjects and to be talking about things that used to only be seen inside the newsroom by other reporters, when they sort of became more authentic and more open, that's when people started questioning. The same can be said of our political institutions. Having a president who uses Twitter versus a president who goes through a PR person who allows for less transparency, but kind of more authority on, we are a part of this institution. We've become less and less an institutional democracy and much more a personality-driven culture. And that weakens all of the institutions that used to kind of rely on that magic and sort of that authority that was given to them because we didn't know necessarily what was going on, or we didn't have sort of this authentic interaction with the principal or the kind of person and figure. So I think that's what we're seeing globally across all institutions, is that this sort of movement to direct communication with people and authenticity has actually weakened the institutions that give these people power.
Yeah, it's interesting. Corporations used to have more of a apolitical stance, partially because, Jordan used to say, hey, Republicans buy sneakers too. But then also because, corporations didn't have Twitter handles and people weren't asking them for their direct opinion all the time. We didn't sort of personify corporations in the same way we do today, both legally and sort of via technology. And it's one thing I worry about, or maybe it's not a worry, maybe it's just a trend, is corporate increasingly taking stands in ways that further polarize or alienate people, and that you're just going to have, these are companies where like left people work, and these are companies where right people work. And I think, the incidents that happened in the last month, or last few weeks, which are, tragic and have basically uniform agreement on, but have encouraged people to make statements that some people, say, hey, they're not political, we have uniform agreement on them. But at the same time, if someone is saying, hey, Trump is a threat to your life, then it's sort of by definition political, and some, like it involves politics, i.e. Trump. And so I brought up questions about, is it okay to be a Trump supporter at certain companies? Are companies going to just basically fragment along, hey, here are companies that have conservatives, here are companies that don't, and what that means going forward for sort of how corporations speak out. What is interesting to you about this topic, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this topic from the lens of sort of the history of Silicon Valley and startups as political institutions. What I think people forget is, and the sort of predominant way that we build companies now, particularly companies that can scale to the size of Facebook and Uber and Airbnb, is through venture-backed companies. And the way that we build companies is by saying, pick people who are usually not going to work in a bureaucracy. Like, everyone forgets that Silicon Valley is built of misfits. These are people who can't work in other institutions, and so they build their own. And they usually have a mission or a thesis that is antithetical to the dominant narrative, whether it's in their industry, whether it's the dominant belief of the country. Like, it's usually something that is polarizing by nature. And so what I think you see from startups in particular is that early stage companies are, tied to one mission. They're people who are very sold on this mission because they're building it against sort of the grain. And they're talking about it authentically, directly with their customers much more early on. And so we now have that expectation. It's part of the DNA of the companies that are being built here, but it's now the expectation, if you are a tech company and you're coming of this culture where you have to be authentic with your users, and you also are built by people who are tied to this mission, by their nature, these companies are probably going to be more polarized at the early stage. And then there becomes a question of when you become Facebook or when you become Google and you're serving the entire world, how do you serve all of these different voices and all of these different people when there is a unique mission and a unique sort of true believer set of people at the company who started it for a very specific reason? So I think we have to keep that in mind, because I don't think this way of company building is going away. And I do think that it's far more political than people like to admit, because a lot of these missions and a lot of the people building them are building it because they disagree with the way things have been done before.
Let me ask a question about, I went back to media corporations. There's some billionaires who own media corporations, right? Jeff Bezos owns Washington Post. I think Benioff might own one. Carlos Slim has some involvement in New York Times. What is the relationship between ownership and editorial? And could you imagine more should Mark Zuckerberg have bought the New York Times, years ago? What is sort of the relationship between billionaires owning media corporations? Do they actually have editorial? Are they, wielding it? And is that an effective strategy for billionaires?
It is very different at each paper, and there's a lot of debate on this. I'd say the most extreme case was when Sam Zell bought the Chicago Tribune. I believe it was maybe a decade and a half ago, and was so involved in editorial that pretty much everyone quit. It was horrible in terms of kind of the oversight that he was dictating to reporters and the treatment of reporters. There was actually very little respect for the people he was working with. Jeff Bezos, on the other hand, from everything that I've heard, is very hands-off in terms of editorial. And, I think one of the interesting things that I thought was sort of funny is, when he decided to write a Medium post about having his phone hacked or having pictures released, he did it on Medium and didn't do it through the Washington Post. And I remember seeing a tweet from some people at the Washington Post saying, this is like every op-ed editor's worst fear, is the big story didn't even go to your own op-ed page. So it's interesting. I think there's always skepticism. There's skepticism inside newsrooms too. When a billionaire buys a paper, how hands-on are they going to be, and are they going to change the tenor of coverage? But there is this sort of very important divide between editorial and business and reporting that has existed long at these institutions. And, reporters are very headstrong people, and they take a lot of pride in that. And I think if there were significant overreach, most of the top reporters would resign in protest or not participate.
So we're nearing close here. I want to wrap on sort of some of the investor perspective on some of these topics. We've talked about religion, we've talked about media. I'm curious for your sort of requests for startups or things that you're looking at. For example, on the journalism side, would you have backed Substack or something like it, or what could you see yourself backing that's really disruptive? And I presume it's not like a BuzzFeed or a Vox or just another one of these things, but something truly that disrupts the business model or the product itself. That's my assumption. And on the religion side, I see a lot of, this is a crazy question, sustaining innovation, basically things that help people get more in touch with Christianity. I have a crazy question, which is why aren't people creating new religions? We have new social media platforms or new tech platforms every 50 years or so. Why aren't people either updating in serious ways or creating new ones, or are they, but they just don't look like Christianity, they look like CrossFit or something? What's your take here?
Yeah, no, I mean, on your first question, I am very eager to talk to anyone who is building something for independent journalists or independent creators. I do think that's probably the only solution. We can talk about wouldn't it have been nice to be living in the past and having these institutional journalists doing such great work. I know when I was a reporter, I sort of longed for the golden years of the 80s and 90s, but I don't think that's possible anymore. And so what is the solution going forward? I think it's more voices rather than less. And I do think it's subscription versus advertising revenue, because it's much harder to game subscription. And I think people will pay for quality. That's always been something and that we've seen across any sort of consumer company. So I'm excited for quality journalism to be backed by consumers. So anyone supporting that mission, I'd love to talk to them. On the religion side, I do think that COVID and the conversations this country is having about race and all of the events of 2020, but even the last 5 years, are leading people to question these larger questions of what the meaning of life is, and are leading to more seeking. And even if it's not seeking in the traditional sense of going to church or going to a synagogue or going to a mosque, but it's seeking in a more spiritual context, that is something that all major world religions contribute to. And what I like about this kind of new generation of tech companies is that they're not forcing you to really change a behavior. They're taking the kind of best parts of a lot of these religions and they're allowing people to do it from the comfort of their own home, which is why I think they've seen this incredible COVID bump. But I think they're going to continue to see that as these crises and questions continue in our country and continue globally, frankly. Religiosity is on the rise globally. 86% of people globally identify with a religion. So I think in terms of an investable area, it's one of the most ignored areas and one of the largest markets. So it's definitely a great place to invest. But to your question on why ancient religions and not new ones, it's a very good question. I think the ancient religions have been largely overlooked by, kind of the media narrative now and offer, they all offer the things that people have been looking for thousands of years, and that's why they've survived. So it would be interesting to see what a new religion would look like in terms of does it speak to the vast majority of people who may be getting sort of their questions answered through these ancient religions that have been passed down for generations. But it is a good question. It's one that I hear a lot in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, but perhaps people don't change that much, and they've worked for thousands of years, and they continue to work. So perhaps in closing, and it's hard to predict, future interests, but I'm curious, like if Katherine, if you come back to this podcast 6 months from now, a year from now, what do you think our topic will be then, or what do you think your next piece is on, or what are some other areas in which or another area in which you're excited to dig into, or learn more about, or explore, or write about?
Yeah, I mean, so religion and media have been taking up a lot of my time, and as you know, I spend a lot of time in deep tech as well. And COVID has changed so many things about our society, and I do think there's a tendency to say, well, things will go back. But I also think this has just been a historic year in terms of the number of changes that have happened in the country and how kind of history has accelerated. And I think that means that it's going to, for highly regulated industries, which I spend a lot of time in, there's going to be a lot of changes that stick. And healthcare is certainly one. I recently invested in a telehealth company that helps people overcome opioid addiction. And for years had been looking at that thesis as, why is it so difficult to match doctors with patients who need access to Suboxone? And a lot of the question was regulatory. You couldn't do it digitally. And now you can, because COVID has relaxed those laws to make sure that people who are struggling with opioid addiction and who are on therapies to treat it can now get access to their medications. And so I hope we don't go back. I hope we continue that solution, because it is a really powerful solution. The company I invested in is Ophelia Health, and they've done extraordinary work during this crisis. And so I think we'll see more companies that are benefiting from changes in regulation and changes in how people think about what can be done remotely versus what has to be done in person. So I'm sure I'll have many more theses as we come out of this crisis and out of COVID related to a lot of those issues.
You'll have to come back then. My guest today has been Katherine Boyle. Katherine is a partner at General Catalyst. If you're an entrepreneur working in something in these topics, religion, media, but also deep tech, gov tech, we have a co-investment in biotech co-investment in Spring Discovery. I believe Katherine helps run the SEED program. Is that accurate?
I do.
Definitely work with Katherine. We highly recommend it. Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much again.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.